love what you do and go on as many podcasts as possible to talk about what you're passionate about. At the end of the day, if you believe in what you do, the money will find you.
Microphone check 1 2. What is this?
You're now listening to a brand new episode of the Play Big Fadter Podcast.
Look what you done started. Let's go.
Welcome to another episode of the Play Big Fadter Podcast. We're joined in this episode by 15-year podcasting veteran Richard Butler. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate getting the opportunity to come in here and chop it up with you.
I was feeling insecure when I was looking at your bio and all the podcast experience you have, but I'm really excited just to learn more about your podcasting journey. And hopefully for entrepreneurs out there who may not have a podcast, they may be inspired to consider one.
Okay, so I'll give you the short version. I started podcasting in 2006 when podcasts first debuted on Apple Podcasts, or iTunes as it was at the time. And what happened was I came upon it as a listener first, and I found all of these shows that I was such a huge fan of, and it catered to a lot of my interests. And one of the shows at the time was a show airing out of Chicago called Video Game News Radio. A group of fellows from Chicago were doing the podcast talking about video games, but they were doing it in a I don't want to say non-professional, but in a more casual barbershop, sit around, chop it up with your friends type of a presentation. And I was just like, wow, this is really cool. These guys are just talking about it without any sort of window dressing. And as I listened to the podcast, I became an engaged member of the audience. And back then they were doing their shows with Skype, and they were like, hey, why don't you call in one day? And I called in, and next thing, one call turned into, hey man, why don't you come on a podcast and talk about X? And did that a few times, and I developed a really good relationship with them, and they were like, man, you should do your own. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. And then one of their listeners, a gentleman out of Canada, he was like, listen, man, I'm doing a podcast. I'd love for you to be a second mic. I like the fact that you have a New York accent. It's good. It parallels my Canadian accent. I said, oh, okay, fine, no problem. So we recorded a bunch of episodes, and said the same thing. He was like, man, you really should start your own. And I was like, okay, and mulled it over a bit and decided, you know what, let's see what happens. So I launched my first podcast, which was My Take Radio. And at the time, I was just pressing record and recording into the void. And the podcast was basically an intersection of all of my interests: professional wrestling, mixed martial arts, video games, and entertainment. So I wanted to find my tribe, people that liked all of the same stuff that I did, that it wasn't that one-dimensional fan base that's only ride or die for one type of a medium. So I wanted to find more folks like me that liked watching the UFC, but liked watching pro wrestling and occasionally played some video games, loved reading comic books and geeking out about nerdy stuff. And before you know it, I just recorded, just with not reckless abandon, but just press record, and didn't really have all of the nuances of podcasting under my belt. I just press record, uploaded it, and hope for the best. And then what happened was I got something that happens to many podcasters, which was creative burnout. I got burned out. It started becoming a chore. It started becoming annoying. My publishing frequency started to decrease. Life got in the way, and I just left it. I pod faded, which is the term a lot of pros use. So what happened was I ended up getting an email from a company called Blog Talk Radio, and they said to me, hey, we've heard your podcast. We think you would be a great addition to our service. And I said, okay, tell me more about it. And they're like, are you familiar with how terrestrial radio operates? And I'm like, yeah, sure. You have somebody working the board, people call in, you do all of that stuff. And they were like, yeah, we have that as part of our service. And we think the way you do your show would be a great beta to do a live studio audience. So next thing you know, I consulted with a good friend of mine. He was a moderator for MySpace, dating myself a bit. And I asked him, I said, hey man, would you be interested in like screening calls for me, doing what you do for MySpace, just on a personal level? And he was like, sure, why not? And just like that, we started doing My Take Radio live from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. And it was exactly that. Just 3 segments: MMA, wrestling, and then gaming and entertainment were together. And it was good because it was overnight. which allowed us to be a little more carefree, a little more blue, do a little bit more jokes, do a lot of that stuff. And the thing about it was, it just worked. And it was great because you had a live studio audience. They could come in, they could put questions in the chat, they could call in, their calls would be screened. And what that did was it created opportunities for us to have different guests. We started getting professional fighters and wrestlers, people from the gaming industry, and it was a blast. And the funny thing was that, like with anything, you want to keep up with the Joneses. So once you had the podcast, they're like, oh, you need a website. So then I built a website, and the website turned into me covering the things that I talked about on the show. So I'd go to wrestling events, I'd go to MMA fights, I'd review video games, I'd review movies, I'd go to Toy Fair, all of the stuff that covered and encompassed my fandoms. But anything else, we started reaching a point where you started, I guess you want to say, you start growing up. I got engaged, got married, etc. And I was like doing this show for 3 hours, 4 hours a clip, because I would broadcast from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m., finish the show at 2, start editing around 2:30, finish editing by 4 a.m., put the show out as a podcast, go to bed, wake up for work, wash, rinse, and repeat every week for 400 episodes. And what ended up happening was I decided, once my wife and I got married, I was like, oh, I'm going to split the podcast and do it twice a week so that I don't have to do it for such a long period of time. And I did that for a little bit to try and ease my, not boredom, but just like mental fatigue of the prep that comes with doing podcasting, which I'm sure all too well. And I said, you know what? 400 is a good number to wrap things up. And what happened was, a lot of the people that were helping, that were listeners, that ended up becoming writers for the website, they said, oh, Rich, we'd love to start podcasting. We'd love to get in on it. And I said, okay, fine. And they were like, but we're not good at the RSS feeds and all the stuff. Can you help us out? I said, yeah, not a problem. So I started helping them out. And when I let them know that I was winding down, I was like, I'll tell you what, the feed that I've established for my podcast, which is over a decade, well over a decade old at this time, I said, you know what, let's make a podcast network. I'll use my show as the anchor to bring people in, and then cross promote your shows. And then next thing, my show brought in 3 other podcasts, and it was easy for me to sunset my show and move into the production side of things. And since then, I got back behind the microphone once with a friend of mine for a comic book podcast. And then anything else, you can't stay away. So I launched a podcast called Toys and Tech of the Trade, which is an interview-based podcast, but it still ties into my fandoms because I use toys in a more generic sense, like what are things that people obsess over, but also what they use to run their business and be more productive. So it's a nice way, again, of just intersecting those different things.
You have been in this game for a while, but
Yes.
there was a time when you actually had a Gary V experience. How did that inform your decision to move forward?
So at the time, like anyone else who's familiar with Gary Vee, Alex Harmozy, all these guys that come out and they have that in your face, here's what you have to do. Entrepreneurship sucks, but I'm going to make it awesome for you and speak to you in your own language. Next thing you know, you have this guy, Gary, he comes in, he starts doing all this social media stuff, all this podcasting stuff. And I'm like, man, this guy, he speaks to me the way that's relatable to me. Meaning, you got a little bit of that rough around the edges New York delivery. And I was like, man, this guy, it, I get it. It resonates. So consume the content, read the books, etc. Saw him appearing at a Photo Plus Expo with a guy named Chase Jarvis, who's also a longtime content creator. And they were doing a panel together. And one of the things about Gary, for those familiar with him, is that he doesn't like to do presentations. He likes to talk and do Q&As. And I said, you know what? I'm going to talk to him and see if what I'm doing, if the juice is worth the squeeze, like if everything I'm doing, if I should really continue it or not. So I hadn't started my podcast network at the time. I was just kicking around a podcast with a buddy of mine, and the network was loose in organization. So I go into the panel. I actually had a Gary V sweatshirt that he put out that said hustle. And before he started speaking, I went over to him and he was like, hey man, nice sweatshirt. I'm like, yeah, this self-help guru guy put it out. I figured I'd throw him a few bucks, and he laughed. And I was like, hey, can I get a picture? And we took a picture together. So when he started doing the conversation with Chase Jarvis, I was standing. I didn't sit. I was standing at in front of a column watching the presentation. So when he was like, "Oh, we want people taking for Q&A," my hand shot up immediately. And Chase was like, "Hey man, that guy stood the entire time. Like that guy's into it." And they brought me up and I introduced myself. I said what I was doing. I'm like, "Listen, I've been doing this a long time, blah, 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 blah. Would like to run this as a business, do this full time and not be part of the rat race like everyone else." And he was like, "Man, you've been doing this a long time, but maybe you need a partner." He said, "Maybe you need somebody to handle the business side because you're a creative." He goes, "Maybe you're a great creative and a crappy business person." He goes, "Or maybe if you haven't made it, it's just because your stuff is not good." And I was just like, damn. And then it plants that seed in your head. And I'm like, I've been doing this a long time, man. And I got the numbers to back it up. And the thing about it was I was looking at the golden ticket, which happens to many podcasters, which is they look and they're like, I want to be the next Joe Rogan. I want to be Tim Ferriss. And I'm like, that's not how this works. You have to be of service. You have to bring value and the money will find you. You don't necessarily always find it. And my thing was that I was like, hey, I want to go and I want to turn this into a cash register and make money. And I was like, that's not the right way. And by him putting that in perspective for me, he was like, maybe this isn't for you. And he's like, you've been doing it a long time. You seem to be dedicated and putting in a lot of work, but maybe you need somebody to shoulder the burden because you can't be both. And I was like, all right. And people in the audience, they were just like, wow, like they were blown away. And he was like, I wish I could help you, man. I'd love to do something. And then but I'm busy. And he does his stuff and whatever. And it was great. So after that happened, I was dejected. And I remember I called my wife and I was like, I feel like pulling the plug on all this stuff because it's just, I feel like I'm spinning my wheels. I had this exchange with Gary and this and this. And I remember my wife said to me, she's like, you got to remember, Gary worked for his dad, built up his dad's business, then used his dad's business as a foundation to launch his agency and all the stuff. So he already had his chops. He already honed his skills in entrepreneurship and business by working with his dad. Me, I'm just a kid from Queens that decided, oh, I'm going to turn on a microphone and talk about people punching each other in the face and comic books and video games and stuff and hope for the best. So at that point, I remember I was gonna pull the plug, and then, like I was saying before, a lot of the guys that worked on the site, they were like, "Man, we want to launch podcasts and this." And I realized that instead of me worrying about financial financial rewards, I should be focused on just rewards for making the space better, for helping new creators to come into the space, for being somebody that's a catalyst for somebody to start pressing record instead of just focused making it about me. And once that happened, then I just my brain switched. Everything, it just became easier. Recording podcasts was easy, running social, doing content, etc. It just became easier because I realized that at the end of the day, I'm creating content for me, but I'm also creating content for somebody else. And I say it often when I speak on different places. I tell people when you're a podcaster, you're someone's drive, you're someone's passenger on their drive to work. You're someone's training buddy in a gym. You're someone's therapist. You bring a smile to someone's face. You do something. You may think it's nothing, but somewhere out there, there's somebody who's deciding to do a podcast about paper clips that is all of a sudden connecting with people that love paper clips just as much as they do, and they don't even know it. And that kind of became a big motivating factor for me of just striving to leave the space better than when I entered it. So by having the podcast network that I have now, I remove all of the roadblocks that stop people from creating podcasts. Because what we do is, unlike a lot of conventional networks, is that we have one feed that has all of our shows. So what happens is, I always tell people when you watch the Super Bowl, you might be a sports person, you watch the Super Bowl's over, the channel, let's say CBS says, "Oh, we're going to debut Will and Grace or Friends or whatever." And you'll be like, "Ah, let me check it out." All of a sudden you watch it, you like the show, now they have a new viewer. So with our podcast network, let's say someone's doing a sports podcast and they finish the show, and then the next podcast that plays is about entrepreneurship or starting your own business. Maybe that person's been a side hustler kicking an idea around. Now all of a sudden they'll be like, oh, let me see what this is all about. Now, all of a sudden, that show has a new listener that just so happens to like sports. And, or maybe let's flip it around. Maybe it's an entrepreneur that just happens to like pro wrestling and decides, oh man, there's a wrestling show here. Let me see what that's all about. Now, all of a sudden, you got a one-stop shop for everything. By allowing us to do that, we eliminate the gray period, which is being a podcaster. This, when you submit your podcast to iTunes or Apple Podcast nowadays, Spotify, etc., you got to wait a week or 2 or 3 weeks for your shows to go live. And what happens in those 2 or 3 weeks is very make or break for a lot of podcasters, because they may pod fade, they may not be recording because their shows aren't reaching people. By having the shows on the network, they can already start building an audience. And what we do is we publish the shows on our network feed first, while their shows are being populated on all of these services. Once their shows are live, we publish their shows directly to their personal feeds, and then we syndicate those episodes 48 hours later on the network feed. So what happens is you're always reaching a new audience. And what we tell them is, hey, your feeds are live, let your audience know. And they'll be like, hey, we're live on Spotify, Apple, etc. Find us here. But new people are still hearing them on the network. So we offer not only the foundation for them to start building the show, but we also give them access to everything that we've built. So their shows get promoted on our socials. You'll see some of the podcasts on my LinkedIn. You'll see them on the LinkedIn for RageWorks. You'll see them on our Instagrams, on our Twitter, etc., or X at this time. So they're always going to have an opportunity to be in front of people, and all they have to focus on is the simplest thing, which is pressing record. And that's it.
Wow. So tell me this, what are some of the mistakes that you see new podcasters making that may cause them burnout and slow down their growth potential?
They don't set expectations. They're not gracious or kind to themselves, meaning that they say, oh, I got to put out a new show every week. Sure. But do you have the time, bandwidth, and patience to do it every week? Maybe you need to do it every 2 weeks. Maybe you need to do it monthly. Maybe those first few episodes, you're going to release them every month. And then once you get a groove and an adjustment on time and patience and editing and everything else and all the nuances that come with it, then you can decide to do it differently. I'll see people, oh, I want to do a daily podcast. Most of us forget sometimes to brush our teeth every day of the week. And you want to hit record, do show prep, do the socials, create cover art, and do everything off the bat? Sometimes we don't wear matching socks. And people come in, I'm going to do a podcast every week. Okay, if you can, awesome. You're ahead of the game. But if you're not, I like to tell them to take their meds, which is minimal effective dose. So when I tell people that, they're like, what does that mean? The average podcast fades out or doesn't make it to 10 episodes. This is out there. This metric is proven and it's been dissected numerous times. I tell people, get to 10. Once you get to 10, then say, all right, I got to 10. Let me get to 15. Let me get to 20. Slowly move that goalpost. I made it to 10. I made it to 15. I made it to 20. Now, whether that's 10 weeks or every 2 weeks or 10 months, but at least, and you set the expectations, you tell your audience, you don't say, hey, my podcast is going to be available every Friday at 5 p.m. Maybe it isn't. Life gets in the way. I'm sure if you're looking forward to seeing your favorite show and it gets preempted, you're going to be annoyed. Think of your audience the same way. If you tell them Fridays at 5 and it doesn't come out Fridays at 5, it's forgivable once, forgivable twice. On the third time, they're just like, this person. So what you do is you go, hey, new episodes come Fridays. Whether it's Friday at midnight, 11 p.m., 2 p.m., 3 a.m., whatever it is, they know Fridays they're going to get a new episode. Now you've just removed a bottleneck or roadblock that may stop you, because you'll be like, oh, I got to pick my kid up from school. I can't put the show out at 5 o'clock. Now, boom, you got something set up that removes that hurdle. Maybe you don't want to do a podcast that you're going to continue to do forever. Maybe you got to do 12 episode seasons, 10 episode seasons. That way you knock out 10 episodes, you take a break for 2 weeks, you come back. Hey, season premiere. Now, what you do is you give yourself that opportunity after those 10 episodes to say, okay, what do I need to do for the next 10? What are my tools for success for the next 10 episodes? It could be building my LinkedIn presence, learning how to do better cover art, learning how to edit better. Maybe I want to do video. So when that season finale happens and you have a little break, well, hey, we'll be back in 2 weeks. Hey, we'll be back in a month. That means you have 2 to 4 weeks to level up so that you can continue the journey. That way, the expectations are set for yourself and for your audience. And that's usually what happens. I think that people, they look at podcasting as just you speaking into a void. But like I said, you're someone's co pilot, you're someone's voice on their train ride, you're someone's gym partner. And I know that if I'm training with somebody or if I'm going to be in a gym with somebody and they don't show up, I'm going to be annoyed. You have to respect them. The same way you hate when your TV show gets preempted because the president wants to give the State of the Union address and then it returns while the show's in progress and you missed half. You got to think of those annoyances. You have to respect your audience and know that they expect something from you. They're either going to be entertained, engaged, or informed. One of them. And if you can't bring yourself to do that, then don't press record. Because people talk about, hey, there's hundreds and thousands of podcasts, but they never acknowledge how many of them are still active.
So tell me this, because I know a lot of podcasters who have a passion for it. They
Mhm.
may want to make a living doing it. So what are some methods that you would maybe encourage podcasters to consider if they wanted to monetize?
So monetization is the elephant in the room for a lot of podcasters. And the thing about it is there's not a one size fits all approach because everyone's degrees of success are going to be different. But I always start with, again, the minimal effective dose. First thing, if you talk about products that people can buy in stores, you should be going and signing up for an Amazon affiliate account. That's the first thing you should do. If you talk about books, authors, whatever it is, if you talk about every book you read, you make sure that you write show notes. First and foremost, you write show notes, and in there, you link to that book or you link to that product. Or if you like a particular service, you message that service, you go to their page and look to see if they have affiliates or affiliate relationships. You build them, you ask them, hey, I love your stuff, would love to promote it on my podcast. Is there an affiliate link? Do you guys have a promo code, etc.? You have to go where the fish are biting. And again, minimal effective dose. A link is a link. It don't cost nothing. Copy and paste. Take some time and type and write out some decent show notes. That's step one. If you're doing something hyper local, you can say, hey, grocery store owner, I do a podcast talking about our area. Would love to promote it on the show. Would you be interested in advertising on a podcast? And then you have to explain to them, hey, podcasts are evergreen. The person who listened to it this week may be replaced by 5 people next month, might be replaced by 50 people next year. There's always going to be new people that are going to be hearing about your goods, your services, your products. Would you be interested in doing it? And again, don't automatically think that's going to write you the golden ticket. You could tell the person, hey, how much do you pay in advertising in your local newspaper? How much do you pay for a radio spot? Hey, I can give you that kind of access for a fraction of that. These are things, those are easy things. Maybe if you're a good writer and you write good show notes, maybe go to some podcasters. Hey, I saw you write show notes, would love to help you out. Next thing you know, now you're writing for other podcasters, helping their show notes. Maybe you're good at transcription and you have Descript or something like that, and you're good at just dissecting that stuff faster than the average podcaster. Hey, John Q podcaster, I see that you're doing transcripts, would love to help you out. Hey, I can do the first 3 for free and then let me know if you're interested. There's different skills and different ways that you can leverage podcasting as a talent. You can create products, obviously the easy things, create t-shirts, create sweatshirts. You have a catchy saying. There's Patreon, there's Buy Me a Coffee, there's the oldest trick in the book, which is appearing on other shows, growing your audience, becoming a voice. Like I I always joke that I am the most introverted extroverted person, meaning I don't go around collecting friends and hey, I don't do all that, but I talk and I've become decently successful at talking. So next thing, hey, Rich, do you want to speak at this event? Sure. Maybe you're good at that. Next thing, speaking at one event turns to speaking at two, turns speaking at three. Maybe you're good at editing. Hey, I'd love to edit for you. All of a sudden, that's a revenue generator. Maybe you're good at the social game. Maybe you're good at social media clips. Find your niches and squeeze them and put them to work. And then you'll make money. But it's not easy. And that's what separates podcasters that are in it for the long run versus podcasters that are in it. You're either here for a long time or a good time. And a lot of them are here and they're like, yeah, I want to be Joe Rogan. And I'm like, you're going to fail. Because what people don't understand is Joe Rogan did stand up. He did Fear Factor. He does commentary for the UFC. He has a whole other thing, a group of things. And his podcast he created just to scratch an itch for himself. Tim Ferriss, before he did his podcast, had the 4-Hour Work Week, the 4-Hour Body, the 4-Hour Chef. He wrote numerous blogs, different things. And then he said, hey, I'm just going to go and do a podcast. And then all that same tribe of people followed him to that. And that's the thing you got to do. You have to make yourself known. It's easier to get $1 from 100 people than from 1,000 people you don't.
And that is such a good point. So when you talk about having your tribe follow you, if you don't have a tribe and you're starting a podcast, what are decent download numbers? Because you hear if you have so many downloads a month, then you can start getting sponsorships, but you may not start out with 5,000 a month. How do you know you're on the right track?
So this is what I tell people. If I told you, Scherrie, you got a room full of 50 people you're talking to today. Think of what that room looks like with 50 people in it. How many times a week, in 1 week, do you feel you've talked to 50 people? Can you count on one hand? Right?
Yeah.
I tell
definitely.
people the same. So I tell them, hey, if you got 10 people that are listening to your podcast, right? Those are 10 more people than you talk to in a given day that are tuning in because I use this saying a lot. I use horse racing for podcasting because people cheer the horse, but it's the jockey that pushes the horse. Your podcast is the horse. You are the jockey. People should be worried about the podcast because they want to know about you. At the end of the day, you are the podcast. You are the talent. So when people are like, oh, I only got 10 downloads. Have you talked to 10 people today? Did you talk to 10 people in the supermarket? How many people did you talk to by 11 a.m. today? Oh, 3. How many did you heard your podcast? 25. Okay, then. And this is the thing. People, they get obsessed with numbers. But like I said, you got to look big picture. It's not going to come right away. And sometimes, yeah, you'll have lightning in a bottle and you'll come out of the gate swinging. But sometimes you got to get reps in. You got to get the repetitions in. A gymnast isn't born a gymnast. It takes a lot of falling off the rings and falling off the horse to get good at that particular discipline. It's the same thing with podcasting. You got to go out there. You got to spruce it up. You got to pop up on other shows. Nowadays, there's so many podcasts that are hungry for guests. And that's one of the easiest things. If you're passionate about something and you know about something and you can be entertaining about it, email 5 podcasts a day. Hey, I'd love to come on. I've heard a few of your episodes. I think I could bring this to your audience. Now, all of a sudden, people are like, man, who is that person? That person's really cool. Where can I learn more? It's the lessons that are out there in terms of podcasting you can take from any media. Because if you watch Jimmy Fallon or Jimmy Kimmel or Johnny Carson, when an actor or an actress had a project coming out, where would they go? On the show to talk about the project. Now, all of a sudden, they're in a different environment and people are like, hey, that person's really funny, or hey, that person's really witty. Wow, that person's really well spoken. Oh, what movie are they in? Oh, they showed a trailer for it. Let me go check it out. It's as old can be. But, lessons for success are in the past. You have to look at the stuff that works. And if you can't do the bare minimum, don't be mad if you're not successful.
So if you had one piece of advice to share with an entrepreneur on how to play big faster, what would it be?
I would tell them to love what they do and go on as many podcasts as possible to talk about what they're passionate about. And that's just using podcasting as a medium. If I was using it for any entrepreneur, I would say that at the end of the day, if you believe in what you do, the money will find you.
Look, thank you so much. How can people get in contact with you or just find out more about your podcast network?
They can visit us at rageworksnetwork.com. They can also find Rageworks on all social media platforms, and you can always just reach out to us there. Either myself or one of the folks from the network will gladly respond. But if it's a DM on Instagram, usually I'm the one responding. So if you have any questions and you're on Instagram and on any of the Rageworks accounts, feel free to reach out. I'll always either shoot you a voice message or I'll respond to any questions you may have.
Okay, and I'll be sure to include those in the show notes as well. Also, the link to the Gary V podcast that we talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I will definitely send you that.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode, and remember to play big faster.